My name is Emily. I am 33 years old, and I live in New Orleans, Louisiana. I'm going to tell you something that happened to my sister, but it haunts me to this day. She worked as a nurse on the night shift in an abandoned psychiatric hospital that is now mainly used as a storage facility. This happened about 3 years ago, and even after everything she went through there, I still can't explain what happened that night. Before I get into it, I need to explain a little bit about the place. The psychiatric hospital was shut down in the 1960s, but it always had this strange aura, like the past was still trapped in its walls. It was a huge building with endless hallways, and there was one wing, Wing 6, that had been closed off decades ago. They said it was a place where experimental treatments were carried out, and for some reason, no one ever talked much about it. My sister, Clara, had this morbid curiosity about those things, so when she started working there, she heard a lot of stories about the place. But the story that always got to her was about Wing 6. For months, she started hearing strange noises coming from there, especially at night. Whispers, sounds of something dragging on the floor, and even a faint voice, as if someone was calling for help. Clara would tell me that sometimes it felt like she was alone in the hospital. But then she'd hear footsteps, as if someone were walking around, even though the place was abandoned. Of course, the other staff members would say it was all in her head, that the hospital had that effect on people. But deep down, Clara knew there was something wrong, something she couldn't explain. One night, after months of hearing these sounds, she decided to go into Wing 6. She knew it was off limits, but the curiosity was stronger. She told me that, as she walked through the dark hallways, it felt like the very air in the hospital was growing thicker, as if it was watching her. She wasn't alone, but the silence was deafening. The light from her flashlight illuminated just enough for her to see the old, faded propaganda posters on the walls. She felt like someone was watching her, and the sound of her footsteps echoed in a strange way, as if the building itself was alive. She finally reached Wing 6, and the door was locked. But strangely, the key was right there, hanging on the wall next to it. She didn't hesitate and unlocked it. The room was completely empty, but the coldness was intense, even more so than the rest of the building. Clara started searching the place, looking for any clues, and that's when she saw a crumpled piece of paper in the corner of the room. When she went to pick it up, she realized it was a medical chart. She opened the document, and there it was, her name written clearly, Clara Sullivan. It was her name, and the medical record indicated she had been a patient there in 1923, over 40 years before she was born. The shock was immediate. She panicked, her heart racing, and before she could process anything, she heard the sound of a chair creaking. She looked behind her, but there was no one there. She began to feel like the place was closing in on her. The air grew heavier, and when she looked at the medical chart again, her name started to fade slowly, as if it was being erased. Clara rushed to leave the room, but as she stepped out, she felt a presence. Something was watching her. She ran to the exit of the hospital, but what terrified her more was that, when she left, the building seemed different. The doors that were once open slammed shut with a loud bang, and the sounds she had been hearing earlier, footsteps and whispers, seemed closer now, as if she had moved away from a place, but hadn't really left it. When she told me everything, I almost didn't believe her, but there was something in her eyes that told me she wasn't lying. What she found in that Wing 6, and what happened after that, changed everything. Since that night, Clara was never the same. She started having recurring nightmares and would always say she felt a presence in the hospital, even after she had left. I tried to get her to seek help, but she refused. She said the only way to understand what had happened would be to go back to the hospital and investigate further, but that never happened. She quit her job not long after, and the psychiatric hospital was finally shut down for good. What unsettles me even more is that since then, my sister has started finding new medical charts with her name on them, and always from old dates. The strangest thing is that she hasn't even been to the hospital. How is that possible? To this day, I don't know what happened to Clara that night, and honestly, I don't know if I want to know. My name is Cassius, I'm 37 years old, and I live in San Francisco, California. The story I'm about to tell happened a few years ago, but to this day I can't explain what really happened. It's one of those things that shakes you up in a way that, if you haven't lived through it, it's hard to believe. And if you've been through something like this, maybe you'll know what I'm feeling. It all started when my uncle Michael, an amateur photographer, invited me to visit an abandoned hospital outside of Sacramento. He had heard about this place, closed down years ago, but he was obsessed with the idea of capturing images of the ruins. I wasn't too fond of places like that, filled with sad stories and that decaying vibe, but since I've always been somewhat curious, I decided to go with him. The hospital was in a secluded area, far from larger cities. When we arrived, it looked like any other building, covered in plants and vines, as if nature was trying to swallow it whole. My uncle, camera in hand, was ecstatic. He had done some research and knew exactly where he wanted to go. The entrance was blocked, but since he was good at solving problems, he found a way to get us in. The first impression was that everything was pretty degraded. Empty rooms, crumbling ceilings, rusty doors. But then, as we walked down a specific hallway, something caught my attention. Everything was there, as if the hospital had just closed yesterday. Stretchers along the walls, papers scattered, and even the lights still flickering as if the place was functioning normally. It felt like a movie set, but I knew it didn't make sense. What bothered me the most was how perfect that hallway looked. Everything well maintained, everything in place, but there was no one there. No logical explanation. My uncle was more than thrilled. He was snapping pictures of every detail, falling in love with what he was seeing. He was so immersed in the moment that at first I pushed aside my discomfort. "Look at this, Cassius, it's incredible," he kept saying. I just nodded, unsure of what to think. We stayed there for a few hours. I couldn't stop wondering what was going on in that hospital, how something could be so intact after all this time. What disturbed me more was the fact that when my uncle checked the photos on his camera, they were perfect. I'm not just talking about good quality or nice composition, but about a level of detail that didn't match the actual state of the hospital. The next day, my uncle decided to go back to take more pictures and explore other parts of the hospital. I was hesitant, but for some reason I went along. When we arrived, everything was different. The hospital seemed to have been forgotten for years. Dust, rubble, cracks in the walls. But what struck me the most was the hallway. The same hallway where everything had seemed perfect the day before. Now it was completely destroyed. The stretchers were broken, the papers were torn and scattered all over the floor, the lights weren't flickering anymore. Nothing was in place. My uncle looked at me with a nervous smile. "It must be the dust, maybe the wind moved everything," he said, trying to convince himself. But I knew it wasn't just that. That change didn't make sense. What happened? What had been done to make the place look completely different from one day to the next? The worst part was yet to come. My uncle, with a somewhat disturbed expression, turned on the camera and looked at the photos he'd taken the day before. Those photos of the perfect hallway were still there, as if nothing had changed. But what was in front of us, physically, made no sense. The hospital was in ruins now. There was no sign of life. The photos, still on the camera screen, showed the hallway intact, everything in place, as if time had stopped in that part of the hospital. My uncle stood in silence, staring at the camera screen, as if waiting for the images to change. But nothing happened. No matter how hard we tried to find a rational explanation, we couldn't. There was no logical reason for the discrepancy between what we saw the day before and what we found the next day. My uncle became obsessed, trying to figure out what was going on. He started researching the place, talking to people in the area, trying to find records about that hospital. But no one knew anything unusual about the place, just another closed hospital that had been abandoned. When he showed the photos to a professional photographer, the man seemed shocked. He held the camera for a while, examining the images. "These photos, they're not possible. Not from a place like this. And not from a camera like this. It doesn't make sense," he said, but he looked more frightened than intrigued. The truth is, to this day, my uncle and I can't understand what happened that day. I still remember that hallway, the flickering lights, the stretchers and papers, as if the hospital had just been shut down. And the strangest thing of all, the photos. As if in that part of the hospital, time had been frozen, like it was a place outside of reality. In the end, we could never go back to the hospital. When we tried, access was blocked. Something told us that maybe we shouldn't have gone there in the first place. I still don't know what to make of it. The fact is, the photos still exist on his camera to this day. Every time I see them, I get chills, as if it was something that shouldn't have been explained. Something that, in a way, was better left in the past, buried along with the hospital. Something that, when it came back to haunt me, just stopped happening. And no matter how hard I try, I can't forget it. My name is Cale. I am 35 years old, and today I'm going to tell a story that happened to my aunt. I was hesitant to believe her when she first told me, but after everything that happened, I can no longer doubt it. She worked for years in the maternity ward of a hospital in Detroit that was eventually shut down. But what she saw there? Well, I still don't understand it fully. I know that if you ask me, I'll tell you that I still get chills just thinking about it. The hospital where my aunt worked was large and old, but one part of it always seemed isolated, the neonatal wing. That's where the strange things started happening. The hospital had already been shut down for months when she had to go back to make some adjustments on paperwork and equipment. She told me it was just a simple task, nothing too complicated. But from the moment she entered that wing, something felt wrong. She always felt the air was heavier, as if the place was soaked with something that couldn't be explained. It wasn't just the smell of an abandoned building, but something deeper. It was like the space had been marked by a presence, a memory. I could never fully understand what she meant by that, but she would always repeat that the place was breathing, as if it had a life of its own. After the hospital was closed, the lights in that wing kept turning on by themselves. She had been back on other occasions to try and figure out what was going on, but she never could. Sometimes the lights would flicker, as if someone were turning them on and off in a sequence, even though the control keys were locked and the system wasn't working anymore. But it was on one of those nights, while she was going through some files in a room next to the wing, that she heard the sound of monitors. It wasn't just the equipment in the lab, but the heart monitors from the incubators. She told me that during her inspection, she could hear the rhythmic sound of the machines, as if they were fully operational. The problem was that the hospital was shut down, and none of the equipment should have been on. The feeling of being watched as she walked through the wing was unavoidable, and it was then that what she saw left her speechless. She told me that it was in a hallway ahead, where the incubators were still located, that she noticed something moving in the shadows. And it wasn't just any shadow. It was as if one of the incubators, which was apparently empty, had moved on its own. She stood still, staring, trying to process what she was seeing. And then the others started moving as well. The incubators moved slowly, almost imperceptibly, but there was no logical explanation for it. There was no one there to touch them. My aunt didn't know if she was seeing things or if it was a trick of her vision, but what she felt couldn't be ignored. She felt a deep chill, something crawling up her spine and making the air around her feel thicker. The tension in the room was unbearable, but the worst part came after. Suddenly, she heard the sound of crying. Baby cries. They weren't the usual sounds of machines or the ventilation system. It was like multiple babies crying in unison. But when she rushed to check, there was no one there. There were no babies, no doctors, nothing. Just that cry, echoing through the cold walls of that floor. And then the strangest part. The empty incubators were now all moving, as if they had a life of their own. She couldn't understand what was happening, but she knew exactly what she had seen. When the fire destroyed that floor 30 years ago, many babies and staff members were never rescued. Perhaps the cries were the last trace of an unresolved tragedy. Even though no one could have been saved from the flames, the sound of crying never went away. She locked herself in the file room, waiting for the day to break, but the silence only returned when the light finally went out. Things got even worse when she felt the cold touch on her back. She said it was as if someone had brushed against her, a light touch, but it made her whole body shiver. She turned quickly, but there was no one there. The place was empty, yet that feeling of being watched never left. She didn't know what was worse, the fear of being observed or the fact that somewhere something was making all of that happen. She stayed there, sitting in the dark, waiting for the night to end. But the minutes seemed to drag on endlessly. The crying of the babies grew louder and louder, but there was no one to save them. It was as if she were the only witness to that pain, that loss. I can only imagine what she felt at that moment. I would have run as fast as I could. After that day, she never returned to that hospital. And although people tried to discredit her, something inside her knew what she had seen in that wing was more than just a bad dream. She left Detroit shortly after, moved to a different city, a different life. But what she experienced that night never left her. Every time she remembered it, she could hear the cries of the incubators, the sound of the machines beating, as if they were truly alive. She tried telling others, but she was always met with confused looks. Not that she cared, but the weight of carrying such an experience, knowing no one would believe her, was too much to bear. She tried to move on, but the fear never disappeared. I never knew how to explain what happened in that place, but the cries of the incubators and the lights turning on by themselves never left her mind. To this day, whenever we talk about it, she still feels that chill on her spine. And I never looked at Detroit the same way again after that. I know something happened in that wing, something that still hasn't been resolved. And I know that in some way, those souls who left so tragically are still there, waiting to be heard. My name is Alex, I'm 34 years old, and I am from Brooklyn, New York. I have always been skeptical about ghost stories and that kind of thing, but what happened to my cousin Jake will stay in my mind forever. I will never forget what he told me about his experience at the hospital, something that still haunts me and I cannot explain. It was about 4 months ago. Jake had a serious car accident, nothing too grave, but enough to keep him in the hospital for a week. When he went to the hospital, he was badly hurt, with fractures and some bruises, but the doctors said it would be a quick recovery. I visited him every day, and although he was in pain, he seemed to be doing well. But one night, when I went to see him, he told me something that made me stop breathing for a second. Jake said that every night at 1 a.m. he would suddenly wake up, feeling a presence in the room. At first, he thought it was a nightmare, or maybe the effect of the medications. But as the days went by, he started to realize that it wasn't imagination. He told me that every night, without fail, a woman in a hospital gown would appear in the corner of the room, crying, but without making a sound. She would stand there, motionless, her head bowed as if she were mourning something. He couldn't understand what was happening. He was so scared by this that he started avoiding sleeping at night, but he couldn't escape it. I remember when he first told me this, I tried to give a rational explanation. Maybe it's the fatigue, I said, or the medication you're taking. But Jake looked me in the eyes and assured me that it wasn't any of that. He knew he was waking up in the middle of the night, completely sober, and that the presence of that woman seemed too real to be just in his mind. He spoke with such conviction that, at some point, I started to wonder if there was something more to this story. At first, Jake tried to ignore it, thinking it was just a side effect of the trauma from the accident. He even mentioned it to some of the nurses, but no one seemed to pay much attention. They thought he was just recovering from the shock, the exhaustion, nothing important. And then, one night, I was there with him, and I started to realize how much more agitated he had become about it. He could barely rest, and if I mentioned the subject, he became even more tense. His eyes were wide, as if he were trying to remember something important, and every time I saw him move at night, it seemed like he was on high alert. But one night, the story took an even stranger turn. It was one of my visits, and as usual, Jake was agitated. He told me that this woman was there again, like every other night, but this time something was different. He noticed that, although it was 3 a.m., she was there, standing, but with her eyes fixed on him. He told me he was paralyzed, unable to move a muscle, and that he swore she was staring directly at him, as if she wanted something, or as if she was asking for help. He said that at that moment he felt a chill running up his spine, a sense of helplessness. He felt that, if he looked for too long, he might get lost in some kind of trance, something he couldn't control. The next morning, Jake asked the nurse who was on duty to speak with him. He wanted to know who that woman was, but she just responded that she didn't know anyone with those characteristics, and that it must be something in his head. But his feeling that something was wrong only grew. He tried talking to other patients, but no one seemed to have seen anything. He became anxious, desperate, because he felt that woman was there for some reason, as if something hadn't been resolved. He didn't know if he was going crazy or if there was really something strange happening in that room. From that point on, something changed in Jake. He didn't seem the same anymore. The unease was written all over his face, and his nights became increasingly heavy. He couldn't be alone for long. During the day, he tried to talk to the doctors, but the most he got were vague and impersonal answers. They thought it was just part of the recovery process, a way to deal with the trauma. But Jake felt that, every day, he was getting closer to something that he couldn't explain. When the discharge day finally arrived, Jake was relieved, but still with an inexplicable fear in his chest. He was practically counting the days to leave that place, but the last thing he saw in that hospital left me speechless. When he was about to leave, a nurse came to him, saying that she needed to show him a picture of a former patient from the hospital as she was being registered in the files. Jake, confused, agreed, but when he looked at the picture, he felt a cold chill run through his spine. The woman in the picture was the same woman he had seen on the previous nights. It wasn't a coincidence. He knew immediately. The nurse noticed the shock on Jake's face and asked if he was okay. Her name was Clara, and she had died in that same bed the weeks before Jake's accident. The nurse couldn't provide many details about the cause of death, but she mentioned that Clara had been a very beloved patient at the hospital. When Jake saw that photo, panic took over him. He immediately recognized the woman in the picture. It couldn't be a coincidence. The nurse explained that Clara had been very attached to the hospital, and Jake got the feeling that maybe she was still there, in some way unable to leave. The worst part was when the nurse asked if he wanted to know more about Clara, if he was interested in understanding what she was doing there. But Jake didn't want to hear any more. He couldn't handle it. The nurse gave him a smile and advised him to forget what he had seen, but Jake knew that wouldn't leave his mind so easily. After a week, he told me that he started having dreams about Clara, and in every one of them, she was in the corner of the room, with a fixed gaze, and the silence became almost unbearable. To this day, Jake can't stop thinking about it. He told me that, in some way, the presence of that woman stayed with him throughout his stay at the hospital, and he can't understand what happened. The worst part is that when he left, he didn't feel completely relieved. He said that for a long time, he still felt a weight in his chest, as if he was being watched. He never wanted to go back to that place, and honestly, neither did I. After what happened, I started questioning everything I knew about that hospital, and even the people who were there. Maybe there is something we don't understand, something beyond the physical. That hospital, in my opinion, wasn't just a place of healing. For Jake, it was a place where he had an experience no one should go through. I really don't know what happened there, but I am sure of one thing. If you ever need to be admitted to that hospital, pay attention to what happens at night. Maybe you'll see what Jake saw. Or maybe the hospital holds something we should never know.